The neon sign flickered lazily above the entrance of Mason's bar, casting a faint blue glow on the damp sidewalk. Inside, the hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the rhythmic bass of live jazz music created a cozy escape from the chilly night air. It was the kind of place where regulars had their favorite booths, and newcomers were often met with cautious glances. On this particular night, Keanu Reeves entered quietly, the bell on the door jingling as he stepped inside. He wasn't dressed to impress, far from it. He wore a simple, slightly worn leather jacket, faded jeans, and scuffed boots. His hair was a bit messy, as if he'd spent the day wandering the city instead of grooming himself for a night out. To most, he looked like just another tired traveler passing through. But to the bartender, who had grown used to serving wealthy patrons with designer suits and expensive colognes, Keanu didn't fit the image of their clientele. And that was the beginning of the problem. As Keanu approached the bar, he noticed the stares, quick glances from well-dressed couples sipping cocktails, as if they were silently assessing whether he belonged. But Keanu, being who he was, didn't mind. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He just wanted a quiet drink. The bartender, a man in his mid-40s with slicked-back hair and a bow tie, looked up from polishing a glass. His eyes flickered with mild suspicion before he forced a polite smile. "What can I get you?" he asked. "Just a whiskey, neat," Keanu replied, his voice calm and friendly. The bartender poured the drink and set it on the bar, but his gaze lingered on Keanu a moment too long, as if trying to place him. He didn't recognize the man in front of him, at least, not yet. Keanu took a sip, savoring the warmth of the whiskey as it slid down his throat. He stared at the rows of bottles lined up behind the bar, their amber and green hues glowing under soft lighting. For a brief moment, he felt at ease. But the peace didn't last long. Across the room, a group of young professionals, 3 men in tailored suits and a woman with sleek blonde hair, were laughing and sharing stories about their latest business deals. One of them, a man named Todd, noticed Keanu and leaned toward his friends, whispering something that made them all laugh. "Hey," Todd called out, loud enough for Keanu to hear. "Looks like someone wandered in from the wrong side of town." Keanu didn't respond. He wasn't the type to engage in petty confrontations. But Todd wasn't done. He stood up, swaggering over to the bar with his drink in hand. "Hey buddy," he said, leaning against the counter next to Keanu. "You lost? This isn't exactly a place for, well, you." Keanu turned to him, his expression calm but firm. "Just having a drink." Todd smirked, glancing at the bartender. "Doesn't look like he can afford it." Before Keanu could respond, the bartender stepped in. "Look, I don't want any trouble. Maybe you should try somewhere else." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "I haven't done anything wrong." "I know, but we have a certain image to maintain," the bartender replied, lowering his voice as if he were trying to avoid making a scene. "We cater to a specific clientele." The implication was clear, and Keanu understood it. He stood up, finishing the last sip of his whiskey before placing the empty glass on the counter. "No problem," he said quietly, reaching into his pocket to leave a tip. But Todd, sensing an opportunity to further humiliate him, knocked the glass off the counter, where it shattered on the floor. "Oops," Todd said mockingly. "Clumsy me." The bartender glanced nervously between them. "You should go," he said to Keanu. Without a word, Keanu turned and walked toward the door, the cold night air hitting him as he stepped outside. He didn't look back, but if he had, he would have seen the smug faces of the people who had judged him. But what they didn't know was that the night wasn't over, and what was about to happen next would be something they'd never forget. The cold night air bit at Keanu's skin as he walked down the sidewalk, the sounds of the bar fading behind him. For a moment, he simply stood still, letting the distant hum of the city wash over him. He had dealt with situations like this before. Fame didn't always protect him from people's assumptions, and he had learned long ago not to take things personally. But tonight, something about the encounter lingered in his mind. Not the humiliation or the snickering laughter, but the deeper truth behind it, how quickly people judged others based on appearances. He exhaled and was about to head back to his hotel when he noticed a small diner across the street, its neon sign flickering in and out like a heartbeat. Something about it felt inviting, so he decided to grab a late-night coffee to shake off the unpleasant experience. As he entered the diner, the warmth inside was a welcome contrast to the chill outside. The place was quiet, with only a few patrons scattered across the booths. A waitress with tired eyes but a warm smile greeted him and led him to a booth near the window. "What can I get you, hon?" she asked. "Just a coffee," Keanu replied. "Black." She nodded and disappeared behind the counter. Keanu leaned back, staring out the window as the city continued its nightly rhythm. Cars passed by, their headlights reflecting off the wet pavement, while pedestrians hurried along, bundled up against the cold. He was lost in thought when the bell above the diner's door jingled, signaling a new arrival. He glanced over and saw a man in his late 50s, wearing an expensive tailored suit and a watch that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. The man looked around, spotted Keanu, and hesitated before making his way to the booth across from him. "Mind if I join you?" the man asked, his voice low but polite. Keanu raised an eyebrow, slightly confused but intrigued. "Go ahead." The man slid into the booth and adjusted his cuffs, exuding an air of confidence that seemed out of place in the humble diner. "I couldn't help but notice what happened back at Mason's bar," he said. Keanu tilted his head. "Were you there?" "I was," the man admitted. "I saw the whole thing." Keanu took a sip of his coffee, waiting for the man to continue. "My name's Charles Harrington," he said, extending his hand. "I'm the owner of Mason's bar." Keanu's eyes narrowed slightly as he shook the man's hand. "You own the place?" Charles nodded. "I wasn't planning on staying long tonight. I was in a private room upstairs, but when I saw the way they treated you, I felt disappointed." Keanu set his cup down, his expression unreadable. "It's not the first time something like this has happened. It won't be the last." "Still," Charles said, leaning forward, "I want to make it right." Keanu leaned back, crossing his arms. "Why does it matter to you now?" Charles sighed, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. "Because I know what it's like to be underestimated. I wasn't always a successful businessman. I worked my way up from nothing, and I've had people look at me like I didn't belong more times than I can count. Seeing what happened to you tonight reminded me of that." Keanu studied him for a moment, sensing that the man's words were genuine. "What do you want to do?" "I'd like to invite you back," Charles said. "Not just for a drink, but for a chance to show those people who you really are." Keanu chuckled softly. "And who do they think I am?" "Someone who doesn't belong," Charles replied. "But they're wrong. And I want them to see that." The waitress returned with a fresh pot of coffee, refilling Keanu's cup before moving on to the next table. Keanu wrapped his hands around the warm mug, considering Charles's offer. "Let me guess," Keanu said after a pause. "You want to make a scene, teach them a lesson?" Charles shook his head. "No, I don't believe in public humiliation. I believe in showing people the truth, letting them realize their mistakes on their own." Keanu smiled faintly. "You're a patient man." "Patience comes with experience," Charles said. "So, what do you say?" Keanu took a long sip of his coffee, the warmth spreading through him as he made his decision. "All right. But if this turns into a spectacle, I'm walking out." "Fair enough," Charles agreed, standing up and straightening his jacket. "I'll see you tomorrow night. Dress however you want." Keanu laughed under his breath. "I was planning on it." As Charles left the diner, Keanu finished his coffee and paid the bill. On his way back to the hotel, he couldn't help but wonder how the next night would play out. He wasn't one for revenge or grand gestures, but there was something satisfying about the idea of returning to the bar, not to prove anything, but to remind people that appearances could be deceiving. What Charles had planned remained a mystery, but Keanu was ready for whatever came next. The following evening, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm. Taxis honked their horns, streetlights flickered, and crowds moved through the sidewalks like rivers splitting and merging. Keanu Reeves walked toward Mason's bar once again, but this time, his mind was clearer. He wore the same leather jacket, the same faded jeans, and the same scuffed boots as the night before. But tonight, something about him was different. As he approached the entrance, the neon sign above the door buzzed faintly, casting its glow on the rain-slicked pavement. He paused for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of jazz music drifting from inside, before pushing the door open. This time, when Keanu entered, there were no cautious glances. No instant judgments. The bar seemed quieter, as if the atmosphere itself sensed that something important was about to happen. Charles Harrington was already waiting at the bar, dressed in a sharp navy suit with a silk pocket square. He waved Keanu over, a welcoming smile on his face. "Glad you came," Charles said, extending a hand. Keanu shook it. "I figured it was worth seeing what you had planned." Charles chuckled and gestured to the bartender, who quickly poured 2 glasses of whiskey. As they sat down, Keanu noticed that several familiar faces from the previous night were scattered throughout the bar, Todd and his friends included. They hadn't spotted him yet, but it was only a matter of time. "Let me guess," Keanu said, taking a sip of his drink. "You invited them back on purpose." "Of course," Charles admitted. "But don't worry, I'm not going to embarrass anyone. Just watch." Todd and his friends were seated in their usual booth, laughing over cocktails and discussing their latest business ventures. Todd's loud voice carried across the room, drawing attention whether people wanted it or not. Keanu leaned back against the bar, observing them with mild amusement. "And what exactly am I supposed to be watching for?" Charles smiled knowingly. "You'll see." A few minutes later, the door to the bar opened again, and this time, the mood shifted. Several heads turned as a well-dressed man in a tailored black suit entered, flanked by 2 business associates. He exuded an air of quiet authority, and even Todd seemed to straighten up slightly when he noticed him. "Do you know who that is?" Charles asked, nodding toward the man. Keanu shook his head. "That's James Lockhart, one of the top venture capitalists in the city. He's made more deals in this bar than I can count. Everyone here respects him, including Todd." As Lockhart approached the bar, Charles stood up and greeted him warmly. "James, good to see you again." "Charles," Lockhart replied with a firm handshake. "It's been a while." His eyes drifted toward Keanu, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of recognition. "And you must be the guest of honor tonight." Keanu raised an eyebrow, but before he could respond, Lockhart extended his hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you. I've been a fan of your work for years." Charles grinned. "I thought it was time you met the man behind the movies." Todd, who had been watching the interaction from across the room, looked visibly confused. He leaned over to his friends, whispering something that made them all glance toward Keanu. It was clear they were trying to piece together why a man like James Lockhart would be talking to someone who, just last night, they had dismissed as unimportant. As the conversation at the bar continued, Todd couldn't resist any longer. He stood up and walked over, his confidence still intact but slightly shaken. "Excuse me," Todd said, addressing Charles. "Mind if I ask what's going on here?" Charles looked at him with the kind of patience reserved for children asking obvious questions. "We're just having a drink." Todd's gaze shifted to Keanu. "With him?" Lockhart chuckled, as if the question itself were amusing. "You don't recognize him, do you?" Todd frowned, his eyes narrowing as he tried to recall where he had seen Keanu before. But before he could answer, Lockhart continued. "This is Keanu Reeves, actor, producer, philanthropist. I'd be surprised if you haven't seen at least one of his movies." The color drained from Todd's face. He looked at Keanu again, but this time with a mixture of shock and embarrassment. "I didn't realize." Keanu, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "You didn't bother to find out." Todd opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The weight of the previous night's events hung heavily between them, and for the first time, Todd seemed genuinely lost for words. Charles clapped him on the shoulder, breaking the tension. "Don't worry, Todd, we all make mistakes. The important thing is learning from them." Todd nodded stiffly, muttering something about needing to get back to his friends before retreating to his booth. His friends, who had watched the entire interaction, avoided making eye contact with Keanu as they whispered among themselves. Lockhart finished his drink and patted Keanu on the back. "It was a pleasure meeting you. Let's catch up again sometime." "Definitely," Keanu replied, shaking his hand. As Lockhart and his associates left the bar, Charles turned to Keanu with a satisfied grin. "How'd that feel?" Keanu laughed softly. "Like the world has a sense of humor." "But you didn't humiliate him," Charles pointed out. "You let the truth do the work." "That's the only way it sticks," Keanu said, finishing his drink. As the night wore on, Mason's bar returned to its usual rhythm, glasses clinking, conversations rising and falling, and the soft hum of jazz creating a backdrop for everything happening inside. Keanu remained seated at the bar, savoring the moment of quiet victory. He wasn't one for revenge, but he did enjoy watching people come to terms with their own mistakes. Charles leaned back against the bar, looking as relaxed as ever. You handled that well. A lot of people in your position would have jumped at the chance to embarrass him. Keanu smirked. Humiliating him wouldn't have changed anything. If anything, it would have just fed into his ego. This way, he has to sit with it. That's the real lesson. Charles nodded, impressed. You're smarter than most people I know. Keanu chuckled. I've had plenty of time to figure things out. Across the room, Todd sat with his friends, but the mood at their table had shifted dramatically. The laughter was gone, replaced by awkward silence and nervous glances in Keanu's direction. Todd stared into his glass, visibly uncomfortable. His friends murmured something to him before quietly getting up and leaving the bar. Todd hesitated for a moment before standing and making his way over to Keanu. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by an awkward stiffness. When he reached the bar, he cleared his throat, but his words came out quieter than expected. Hey, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Keanu turned to face him, his expression neutral. For what? Todd shifted uncomfortably. For the way I treated you last night. I didn't know who you were. Keanu tilted his head slightly, studying him. And if you had known? Todd hesitated, realizing the trap he had walked into. I guess I wouldn't have acted the way I did. That's the problem, Keanu said calmly. Respect shouldn't depend on who someone is or how much money they have. It's basic. You either have it, or you don't. Todd swallowed hard, nodding slowly. You're right. I was wrong. I'm not used to people calling me out on it. Keanu offered a faint smile. Maybe it's time you get used to it. For a moment, Todd stood there, unsure of what else to say. But instead of trying to defend himself further, he simply nodded. Thanks for not making a scene. Consider this your lucky night, Keanu replied. Just do better next time. Todd walked away, and Charles let out a low whistle. You have a way with words, you know that? Keanu shrugged. I've had a lot of practice. They ordered another round of drinks, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Charles shared stories of how he had built his bar from scratch, and Keanu talked about the unexpected places his travels had taken him. It was the kind of conversation that reminded him why he loved moments like this, unscripted, genuine, and filled with the unpredictability of life. As the night wound down, Keanu stood up and slipped on his jacket. Thanks for inviting me back, he said to Charles. I'm glad you came, Charles replied. And don't be a stranger. Next time you're in town, drinks are on me. Keanu laughed softly. I might hold you to that. They shook hands, and Keanu made his way to the door. As he stepped outside, the cool night air greeted him once again, but this time, it felt different. Lighter. The glow of the neon sign above the bar cast its reflection on the wet pavement, but Keanu didn't stop to look back. Instead, he walked down the street, his thoughts drifting to the lessons the night had offered, not just for Todd, but for himself. The world would always have people who judged based on appearances, but that didn't mean you had to carry their judgment with you. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out to see a message from an unknown number. Thank you for the wake-up call. I'll do better. Todd. Keanu smiled, slipping the phone back into his pocket as he continued down the street. The city hummed around him, alive with the possibilities of new encounters, new stories, and new lessons. Because sometimes, the smallest moments, whether a night at a bar or a simple conversation, had the power to ripple outward and create change. And in Keanu's world, those were the moments worth living for.